So this is a topic that seems very maligned, and it's a difficult topic to have because it seems like there's a general sense that it doesn't really matter, and then suddenly it does, or it doesn't really matter, or why does it matter if I put the version in the URL, or if I put it in the query string, or if I put it in the headers, or do I need to think about versioning at all? Why does it matter that your API should be stable? Why should it matter that it's verbs and nouns instead of process order? This is a really tricky topic, and I guess what I want to ask you is first of all, why what is wrong, and why do so many people get it wrong?
I think, as with most things, it comes down to definitions, right? When you think about your API, if you think about it as just a thin layer of HTTP on top of your code, then the code is sort of the primary metaphor and the thing that's driving how you think about the evolution of your interactions with your customers. If you think about your API as information, right, that's being navigated by somebody in arbitrary clients, then that takes on a very different tenor, right? If you're controlling both sides of this, if you're writing the JavaScript side to communicate with the back end through a front end, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do because you're the only consumer of this interaction. But it's once you open it up and you have a larger class of participants that you suddenly can't couple the front end from the back end in the same way that you do when you control both sides. And so that's where a lot of the things that to some developers seem like overkill or not necessary or whatever start to provide the benefit. It's because we're trying to decouple the life cycles of the clients and the servers so they don't have to be released in lockstep, right? If you update your web page, your client code should not, your client browser or whatever should not care unless your web page is using a feature that the browser doesn't support. So clearly when we saw HTML5 evolving and rolling out in pieces, it was very common to get to the point where the new inputs weren't supported or WebRTC wasn't supported or something. But the general interaction style is that the rest of it continued to work. And so we're just trying to embed into the interactions that we have between our front ends and our back ends expressive but evolvable and flexible ways of doing that. And everything that you can do to reduce the coupling is going to help with that. So one thing I want to just say off the bat is, even though I'm very fond of web standards and hypermedia styles and things like that, ultimately you are in charge of your APIs. You get to decide what they look like. You get to decide what the developer experience is. And there is no right or wrong answer. So when Rastafarians point and say that's not REST, it's in part a little bit maybe a failure to communicate, in part a little bit of an attempt to control the brand, right? Because just slapping a URL on some behavior is not going to give you the benefits of a hypermedia RESTful API. And I think part of the confusion comes a little bit from what Dr. Fielding did not set out to define REST. His thesis was about the concept of architectural styles and how a coordinated set of constraints could induce certain properties in the systems that are built around those constraints. And he just chose to use the web architecture as kind of an example architecture to talk through the ideas. And because that had not been formally done, he took the opportunity to formally define the nature of the interactions. So I guess the first thing to point out is there is no difference between the concept of REST and the concept of web. So documents versus data is a false dichotomy. And therefore, one way to think about your API is to think about your experience as a user with a browser. If you point your browser to a website that you've never been to, it doesn't stop and say, I have to read API documentation before we can proceed. It doesn't have to write custom code to interact with No Fluff's webpage or CNN's webpage or something, because it's going to be treated differently than any other URL out there. It has a series of interactions that are based on standards, and those standards are designed to induce certain properties in the interactions. And we have seen the benefit of that over the last 30 or so years, in that we have been able to evolve what's possible. We've been able to evolve the technologies and the implementations on both sides. We've been able to change one without changing the other. And those are the kinds of things that we're trying to induce in our API designs. And so, again, when developers come at this from a code-centric perspective, the rest of all of this just seems like, ivory tower narrative that's fine for the web, or it's fine if there's a person involved, but it's not useful when it's systems talking to other systems, and that's just not the case. We want decoupled systems as much as we want decoupled clients and servers. So, I think the reason it's difficult and the reason so many people have struggled with it, rather than saying that they get it wrong, is that we don't have a common definition of what we're trying to do, right? And so if people, I think, realize that your API interactions can be like your web interactions, then I think that helps at least motivate some of the choices that are going into it.
So let's talk about API styles for a minute,
Mhm.
because one of the things that comes up a lot is well, this isn't really REST. This is more RPC over HTTP, and
Mhm.
there are a number of styles of APIs right now. We do have REST, which is sort of the, I don't want to say de facto, but we see that a lot, and then we see gRPC, and we see, I mean, SOAP. Nobody really seriously makes SOAP APIs anymore, right?
I mean, they still exist, but the thing with SOAP is not, again, that it was bad. It's that the sort of edge cases that it was ultimately designed for was about decontextualizing requests over arbitrary transports, and processing models, right? You're taking the request, and rather than sort of like blocking for something to be done or expecting a particular format to come back, you're trying to canonicalize the request into its own thing so that it could be returned over HTTP and then emailed to somebody and dropped in a file and copied over someplace else. So that's just a very different thing. But when you're talking about interaction between multiple parties and multiple technologies and multiple processes, some that are asynchronous, some that are asynchronous, it was an attempt to solve that multidimensional degrees of freedom. And it just so happens that when you apply that to what most people want, which was a client to server kind of interaction, the complexity was overkill. And so you give up a lot. You give up the notion of content negotiation. You give up a lot of the flexibility in terms of choosing your own representation, or how things, you're sort of like stuck with what can be canonicalized into these forms. And so it just ended up being overkill and expensive, and the libraries and everything that had to be written for it had to track the standards, and it was just all very complex. And honestly, almost nobody in the world knew how to tie everything all together. So it sort of collapsed on its own weight, and the idea of the REST architectural style um, basically moves into a direction where it doesn't matter what kind of data you're asking for, the interaction is the same, right? You name and you point and you ask for it and you say, can I have that? And so an entire class of message disappears. We don't need the get employee message. We don't need the get orders message. We don't need the get, favorite bands message. We just have one message, and it is constrained to be a read-only idempotent interaction. And the reason that's important is because our networks are flaky, right? Particularly as we move from wired to wireless. There's a lot of opportunity for disruption. And in the middle of any interaction that we have, if a client is faced with a network failure, it doesn't know necessarily whether the server got the request or not. Because Git is defined to be a safe and inconsequential there'll be no side effects if it happens twice. It's empowered to try again. So you can imagine in the middle of downloading 20 or 30 files, if two of them failed, we don't want the browser to kind of throw up its hands and say, I'm sorry, user, what do you want me to do? When it can be resilient and just try again. And it has that freedom to try again, regardless of what we're talking about, because of the constraints that are there. Now, a post doesn't mean anything other than, watch out, I'm going to do something crazy. And so we don't have that same kind of freedom, but we do have the ability to modify things on the back end in more idempotent ways, like by using puts and patches, which again can induce more idempotency in the system. So again, the point is, with SOAP, you only had handlers. There were no semantics to the interactions. With REST, we have semantics, and those semantics can then be leveraged by the infrastructure. Whereas, with a SOAP handler, if you don't know whether the server got it or not, you have to send it again to see if it will process it, right? And once it processes it, it can decide whether it needs to handle it or not. But the client is not able to make that decision.
So we've got SOAP, we've got REST, we've got gRPC, but it seems that there's a big move right now towards GraphQL. That's that the perception is that it's addressing deficiencies in REST. REST, it seemed to address deficiencies in SOAP, and GraphQL in turn is addressing deficiencies in REST. Do you agree with that statement? And in general, what are your thoughts there?
I would say it has less to do with REST and more to do with HTTP and the cost of TCP/IP handshaking. The idea is, if your interaction style has the client making a lot of interactions with the server, then the browser is often constrained to the number of threads it can use. It's got to open up connections and close connections. And for certain kinds of interactions, that's a lot of round trips, that's a lot of latency. And GraphQL is an attempt to sort of say, look, let me just tell you what I want and give me back what I want and don't give me anything else. And again, I think GraphQL solves issues that people had with interaction styles. I think it is kind of a half-assed step in the right direction. I think standards-based things like the Sparkle protocol give you the same capability, but what comes out the other end is an actual standard data model that is makes it easy to integrate things without writing custom code. But there are ways of doing that with GraphQL by mixing in something like JSON-LD as well. That being said, I think the move towards HTTP2 and HTTP3 and Quick are going to eliminate a lot of the pain points that GraphQL was designed to solve. And you're going to be able to do multi-channel, multi-request kinds of things directly over HTTP in the first place. And it won't be necessary to set up a separate infrastructure of custom query language that's not standard, doesn't produce standard data, in the offset. So I mean, I guess the difference is GraphQL was a clever solution to a problem people were having, but that doesn't make it a standard. And a de facto standard is better than not a de facto standard. But I think there are limits to how GraphQL expands into something that ultimately is part of the larger vision of the web, which is about all these interlinked resources. So it's I don't have any issue with GraphQL. I don't think it goes far enough. And to the extent that it does require separate infrastructure and separate tooling and separate kind of custom bespoke queries, I think a lot of those issues will kind of evaporate in the coming months and years as we move towards Quick and HTTP3.
So REST is still my go-to. In fact, I've been building an API recently and in trying to think carefully about all of this, because this is going to be a public API. But to your point, often there are unintended consequences of internal APIs. At some point, there's a requirement. The customer needs an API for X, Y, and Z. Oh, we have an API. And all of a sudden, it's an accidental public API.
Hmm.
But regardless, anybody internally who's consuming that, I care about them as well, and I want to come up with a set of consistent standards. But as I'm going through this and thinking about this, I run into all of these little decision points that sometimes I know intuitively are important, but I don't always know how to handle those. One of them is versioning. One of them is naming things. Right? Isn't that one of the two difficult problems in computer science? Cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors.
Right.
Of that's
Right.
as funny as it gets, folks. By the way.
Um, I'm just never mind. I was going to respond to your joke, but so the issue with, like, let's just take issue with versions in URLs. Um, it's not a problem, but again, it's a shortcut, and it's a shortcut that says, I don't know how else to solve this problem, so I am going to commit to a contract, and I am not going to deviate from that contract. Right? That's in essence what a version is doing. And what it's doing is it's conflating the identity of the resource with representation. Ultimately, you're saying I'm committing to a contract in a particular representation, and I'm not going to vary that representation um, until I vary the identity. And that's, again, it's a solution to a problem that people have, but the problem is that they are building highly coupled systems, and therefore changes in the representation tend to end up breaking the client. Whereas that's not at all the way the web works, right? You bookmark something, and if tomorrow there are additional things in there, like additional images or links or places that you can go to, none of that requires versioning. And so it really comes down to, does your representation fundamentally give you the ability to evolve over time, or doesn't it? And if the answer is no, then something like representation or your versioning in the URL is a solution to that problem. But it's a way of saying, I don't have the perspective or the capacity or the interest or whatever to deal with the whole vision of the web. So I'm just going to reframe it down to a highly coupled client server interaction. And again, if you're controlling both sides of it, there's no real issue. But it's just when you start to expand that, it tends to get problematic. So, versioning does need to be handled, but it can be handled at the representation level in a variety of ways. I just think that conflating identity and representation is part of the problem. And so it gets down to ultimately, I think most people don't design their APIs. I think their APIs, as you said, are accidental. They're serializing domain objects, or they're just doing something like that and calling it an API, and that's obviously going to be very fragile. So, um, you know, as I said, you are ultimately in charge of the design experience that your users have. But if that means what you're producing is fragile, then you're not going to be able to evolve it to meet new requirements without changing the versioning. And the problem with that also, sort of psychologically, is if you can't change anything in this one version, then you start to like build up this pressure, and then you change everything in the next version. And now an incremental feature that somebody would like to maybe just casually start using ends up putting a much larger burden on them as the client to shift from version 2 to version 3. So when you can avoid breaking changes, there's no reason to bring versioning into it. It's only when there are breaking changes because of requirements change, or you didn't design things well in the first place. So that's why my ultimate interest is helping people to think more about the design up front. As a quick example, one of the APIs I designed was the Best Buy Commerce API, so that third parties could interact with it and with the backend systems. And in the first release, we were not planning on supporting separate shipping and billing addresses. And so if we had designed the representation at the time to just have a single address, then the shift to move to multiple addresses in the future would have been a breaking change. So even though we weren't supporting that use case, I still encouraged the developers to design in support for multiple addresses. And that way it just became a question of how do you explain to the users how to find this. And so in this particular case, there was an attribute that indicated whether it was a billing or a shipping address. And if you just did a XPath select for the address that had that attribute, then you would find the right one, whether there was one or multiple ones, right? So we generally communicate to our clients, if something shows up that you don't know what it is, just ignore it, right? Don't have a panic just because I added a new link that's not of interest to you. What that does is that it lets other clients evolve to take advantage of that feature on their own terms, but I don't necessarily have to force everybody to move all at once.
So let's look at this from two different directions here for a moment. If we are, and actually a question just came in the chat. What if we are deprecating something?
So again, that's where we have a series of tools, right? And the tools are, again, up to you to enforce. You can allow people to use deprecated stuff as long as you want to. You don't have to let them. You don't have to force them to stop using it if it's no real issue, for you. But you also have the ability, from a business perspective, to encourage them to shift over to the new system if need be. So it really depends on the nature of the deprecation. But my point is simply, it doesn't have to be a forced update. To your earlier points about the nature of APIs, Leonard Richardson defined it as a series of 3 levels, right? And it really has to do with how well do you think or design into your API each of these 3 levels. And they're basically about identity, interaction, and representation. And so the first thing is just, do you use good, clean, stable identifiers for your resources? And again, as you indicated, there's a lot of folklore about what that means. That's going to change what happens on the other side just because you used an S or not. So I personally don't, because I have a different way of thinking about information spaces. But if you use plurals, that's fine. Just be stable, right? Have some stability to your URI design, so that it's not an accidental thing to introduce some new ideas, or you don't have these collisions in terms of what things mean. Standard, right? If that's what you're going to do, you might as well use a different protocol and use proto buffers and things that are going to perform better, because part of the interface definitions that the web uses are about flexibility and evolvability, and those choices do often have performance implications. So again, nobody's saying this is the absolute only way to do it. It's just right now it is the best broad scale approach towards wide interactions. If you stop and think, we exchange information with everybody all day long, right, across multiple channels: friends, family, coworkers, clients, customers, associates. We embed links in emails and documents and tweets and put them in movie posters and advertisements and write them on napkins at meetups and say, hey, come check out my site. And none of that requires anybody to write any custom code. And that's what we're trying to engender. So a URL invoking arbitrary behavior is not a sufficient enough way of dealing with that. So the first step for a level 1 system is to have good, clean, stable identifiers that don't have a tendency to break. Tim Berners-Lee wrote a great piece called "Cool URIs Don't Change." If you just Google that, you'll find the discussion about it. So I really do not encourage anybody to think about level 1 as an endpoint. It just doesn't provide enough value. But a level 2 system has good, stable identifiers but then also has commitment to the constraints of the interaction styles. So that's where getting into the idempotency of put versus post and get versus delete and patch and things like that starts to make a difference, because now it doesn't matter what the resources represent. Your interaction style can be consistent across a wider family of interactions. So you're talking about these decision points. This is an important decision point, right? If I want to treat all of my resources in a similar way, so that I get this benefit of the infrastructure being able to respond to network failure and things like that, then a level 2 system is a perfectly fine place to be. Because the difference between a level 2 system, which is what most people do, and you know that they're doing it because they put version numbers in URLs, or things that are otherwise fragile. The difference between a level 2 system and a level 3 system is really just one of representation. Because a level 3 system is going to have some kind of hypermedia representation that allows you to discover what's possible. Right? And some time and some practice thinking about this. But the difference between a level 0 system and a level 3 system is an entire worldview. So that's what I would suggest is, like, if you're only interested in a level 2 system and you do not want to think about the bigger picture of things, that's a fine place to be. Just try to get some stability into your URLs, because then with content negotiation in the future, you could support somebody asking for a hypermedia representation of the same resource, and nothing else has to change. You don't have to stand up a new server. You don't have to stand up new endpoints, and the system can evolve in that way.
And I hate to ask this, but it looks like their Zoom crashed there for a moment in the middle of what I think a lot of other people would consider a very important point. So in the chat history, for those who didn't have Zoom crash, I know somebody sent a link to that maturity model. But if you're in the chat right now, where approximately where did you lose us? Because I want to, and while we're doing that, I want to.
This is a very clever way to highlight the impact of network failure on communication, Michael.
Well, I thank you for noticing.
Well done. Well done.
Okay. So it looks
I'll summarize again quickly.
Okay.
So the point is, a level 1 system is a way of imagining just taking some APIs that's expressed in code and invoking behavior through URLs. So if you said, example.com action equals deposit and amount equals da 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 da, you're expressing the behavior that you want to be invoked, and it's more like a Harry Potter magic spell than something that you're asking for, right? So there's not a lot of value there. It tends to be slow, and you don't get the benefit of the consistency of the approach, because every URL is to be treated distinctly, which is the exact opposite of what the web does, which is every URL is to be treated the same. A level 2 system introduces the interaction element, which is the verbs, right? The get, post, put, head, options, delete, patch, those sorts of things. And those are designed with certain constraints, because it then says the nature of the interaction is understood from a semantics perspective. And so things like network failure can be mediated independent of what it is you're trying to do. So a level 2 system is a fine place to be, as long as you understand it's a relatively fragile place to be, and you'll need to manage the fragility with something like version numbers in URLs. And so if you can get your organization to a level 2 system, then the shift from 2 to 3 is just a question of representation, and you can add in a new hypermedia representation in the future that a client can ask for. Everyone else can still automatically get the old version, but a client can ask for the hypermedia version, and that doesn't require generally different infrastructure, different servers, different endpoints. So people who have bookmarks and understanding of those endpoints can just simply ask for the new representation and have a more loosely coupled interaction with your servers. So the point is, each of these levels adds more features, and a level 2 is an okay place to be. There's a lot of value that you get there if you're careful about the design. But starting from scratch and trying to jump to level 3 is a lot harder.
And sorry about that. I'm doing too many multitasking things here right now.
That's okay.
But I did post a link, by the way, in the chat for Brian's upcoming 2-day live hands-on workshop, diving very, very deep into this topic. And definitely, I know it's something that I absolutely want to check out because I'm doing this right now. But one of the questions that came up, and I think this is interesting, and I got this just before the Zoom client crashed, but the question was regarding just a good reference implementation of an API, because unfortunately the Best Buy API is invitation only. And I don't know if
Yeah,
you,
and I don't even know if that's so. My involvement with it ended years ago, and I think there have been several iterations since then. And I think they didn't understand what we were doing, and probably threw it away and started from scratch, which is what developers do when they don't know how to evolve APIs. They just throw it away. So that I don't think that's even there necessarily anymore. But the design, one of my favorite designs is the Atom Publishing Protocol. So when you look at RSS 1.0, that was expressed using the RDF data model, but confoundingly, it was expressed using the RDF XML serialization of the data model, which is a much maligned and often deservedly so representation. But the data model itself is actually very, very powerful and part of the bigger picture of what we're talking about here. So developers didn't like RDF XML, therefore they rejected RSS 1.0. And people like Dave Weiner said, okay, let's just start again and design custom XML, and we'll call it RSS 2.0. And the community said, no. Let's not come up with more custom XML. Let's define a hypermedia standard for being able to deal with syndicated content. So the Atom format defines syndicated content of arbitrarily updated things over time, but it's also designed to be a hypermedia representation and the ability to manipulate the published forms for like posting blogs, deleting them, updating them, overwriting them. So that's a pretty clean design. So anything that implements the Atom Publishing Protocol is worth looking at. Beyond that, I'll have to think about that. Some other things. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of poorly designed APIs out there, and that includes stuff that comes from Netflix and Google and Facebook and all these big names that people get excited about. Just because it's got the Google.com stamp on it doesn't mean it's well designed, right? They throw away APIs more than anybody I know, and so it really comes down to what is it that you want for your API. And you have to think about it, how that evolves. But there are some rays of hope. Like we're seeing the emergence of JSON LD as a bridge between regular JSON that developers are comfortable with, and then being able to connect it to larger linked data kinds of initiatives, so that the data from an API can be trivially and without writing custom code connected to other data systems. And so that makes things like microservices that aggregate across backends almost trivial to implement. So it's not just a question of, this one endpoint or this one collection of endpoints. It's how do these fit into the larger world of what we know as an organization? And that's, I think, the part that developers often just don't think about. These resources are not endpoints in a Tomcat instance. These resources are projections of value into the world via network-friendly standards. That's I think the appropriate way to think about them. And I want the results of invoking this API to be able to connect to the results of this API into some kind of composite view of what this understands, or what we understand about this thing, whatever it is. If you look at domain-driven design as a way of defining your APIs, then the bounded context allows us to restrict the boundaries of what we're producing to this particular set of business functionality. But that doesn't mean there aren't other things that we know about accounts and orders and whatnot from other parts of the system. And if the answer is we have to write custom code to link the outputs of two parts of the same organization, that's a fail. That's an organizational failure, particularly given the amount of data that's being produced these days, the explosive growth that will continue on that front. This vision of let's stop and write custom, artisanal, bespoke, gluten-free APIs that you have to read my manifesto to use and then write custom software to use. That approach just does not scale, and will not scale, and will increasingly become a problem. So the sooner you can get on board with the idea of standards-based systems, I think the more likely you'll be able to address the challenges of the present and the future.
And one other example that I've come across in my readings, and I'm curious your thoughts on, is the JSON API standard.
Again, it's not a standard.
Or
it's
style.
It's a way of doing things that people do, and that's fine. But JSON is still the bottleneck there, right? JSON, developers like JSON because it's easy. And when they look at some of the hypermedia systems, they say, oh, that's too complicated, which is nonsense, because I've seen people write hypermedia navigation using Unix command tools, right? You don't have to write custom software. You can just compose tools to navigate mazes and solve them using, maze solving algorithms using tools that were never designed to do that. So I reject the notion that hypermedia is too complicated. I understand that there are interaction patterns that have historically been slow and painful and maybe didn't meet engineering tolerances for service level agreements. And so that's where things like GraphQL start to make sense, or moving to a gRPC based system, if the performance can't be addressed using standards. But my larger point is I don't think most people have fully understood ways of using the standards to solve those problems independently. But the point is, we move to JSON because it's simple and easy, and we have lots of tools for supporting it. But as they say about the cake, JSON is a lie, right? JSON pretends that we can define arbitrary domains as simple decontextualized key value terms, and that is such a uninformed position about the nature of reality and how systems come together. That's why we have to write custom software. Because the custom software is basically serving as the disambiguation of terms and structures across, we have 1,000 APIs means we have 1,000 different ways of doing things. Whereas if you look at things like the Linked Data Project, where you have literally hundreds and thousands of data sets connected by volunteers part-time in a self-describing, discoverable way, it doesn't have to be this short-sighted approach. But because JSON is easier to parse than XML, particularly when namespaces are involved, that's where the affinity for it comes from. But it has no notion of identity. It is not a standard for data interchange. It's a standard for serializing arbitrary, fairly simple structures. But the choices that you make about those serialization layouts, that's the part that then you have to write custom software to deal with. So JSON, like I said, JSON LD is an attempt to link these worlds together to keep your JSON as simple as possible. And in many cases, you don't even have to change it. But understanding that if you want to project a stronger, more flexible business value and do so for longer, you're going to need a standard like that, not another custom bespoke way of doing things that a lot of people do. Right? That's not a standard, and that does not give you the same sort of network effects.
And actually, I had the opportunity to sit in on your linked data talk some time ago, and I was very impressed I was already impressed when you demonstrated some of these linked data concepts, but then when you got to JSON LD, because I'm sitting here, not quite salivated, but very excited about some of these possibilities and starting to grasp some of the implications there. I was in parallel thinking this is going to be really complicated to put together. And then you start talking about JSON LD, and I think uh, I felt like the JSON LD was almost a magic trick. It's just ta-da.
Mm-hmm.
You want to see it again? Because it was literally that simple. Does that do away then with some of the API versioning issues if you've got this stable?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because again, JSON LD is just JSON, but it's JSON that advertises additional abilities. Like you can advertise the subject of a document in a discoverable way. It has a way of indicating types and things being, part of a type system. And again, in a discoverable kind of way. But it also allows you to exchange different versions of JSON with somebody else. And where you agree, you can make that a mechanical process. That doesn't need to be any real custom code translation or anything. You just say, okay, well, here's your JSON. Let me sort of extract just the terms that we have in common and then reshape it in the way that I want to see it with my terms. And again, that can be a mechanical process. And so the point is, it's enough semantic sprinkling on top of JSON in ways that can be discoverable. So fundamentally, the issue with JSON is the issue with best friends, right? Best friends are great, but everybody can't be your best friend. It takes time and energy and commitment to become best friends with somebody. But once you have a long shared history, you have a shared context, and you can make simple references and everybody understands what you mean. It's just that's not the way the world works, right? You need to be able to have conversations with somebody at the coffee shop or somebody on a bus or somebody that you just met. And where you have similar ways of describing things, you can connect. And so it's really just a way of saying, look, you can have your simple format, but we need to be able to map it into this larger world. And we can do things like use RFC 5988 link response headers to say, give me JSON, tell me that it's just JSON, but I'll leave a little breadcrumb trail for those with eyes to see and ears to hear to find a way of contextualizing this into a richer model so that it can be connected without writing custom software. So again, that's why I think, a level 2 API, I don't, it's not how I would go about it, but I don't want to say that's a bad thing to do. I just want people to understand, do it deliberately. Do it that way because that's how you want it to be done, not because that's the way that you see everybody else do it. Because there are other ways of doing it that do not require that particular approach. But even if you do that approach, we have ways of extending it into these larger ecosystems. And we can evolve once you commit to good, clean resource design. So that's why when people say things like, nouns are important, they're just trying to think, they're trying to get you to think in terms of the information. And then the question is, how do you interact or manipulate the information? So that's a separate issue. That's the interaction model. But what is the information in the first place? And why does anybody care? And if I bookmark it, I want it to continue to work a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, a year from now, 5 years from now. I don't want it to say, oh, well, you stopped using Perl and now you're using Ruby. Oh, you stopped using Ruby and now you're using Java. Oh, you stopped using Java, now you're using Node. I don't want any of those transitions to break my interest in this thing that you produced 6 years ago. And there's no reason that it has to, except that people are, don't spend enough time thinking about the design. Or the focus is the code, which then very obviously code-specific kinds of evolution will make its way into the quote API, and it will be very fragile and everything will break, and then that's why you have to lock down to a contract.
And a couple comments in the chat here that I want to go through. First of all, as you've been going, folks have been grabbing links to references and dropping them in the chat. So thank you for that. That is super helpful. That's one fewer thing.
And how much custom API, how much custom code had to be written in that process? None. That's the point, right?
Which is awesome. A few other things. Jim says, "I love your best friend's analogy. I will be borrowing it. I think I might
Please
as
do.
well. That is very concise and yes." And then another comment here is on JSON schema. So the comment here is, "I really dig JSON schema because it doesn't prescribe adding cruft to my plain old JSON or wrapping everything in a container, but it lets me describe them in a standard way."
So I would say, cruft is a loaded term there. So there are certain biases that are um, expressed in the asking of the question. As I indicated with like JSON LD, you can externalize almost all of that, if not all of that. So you can still um, you could still have your plain old JSON and make it usable by others who you've never spoken with. So that's what that so-called cruft will do for you, but it does not have to be sprinkled into your JSON to change it if the pristine form is what you're going for. That being said, JSON schema is a fine way of validating structure and expressing intent. The problem is there is no actual there's not the same notion of a data model at the other end, right? The thing about JSON LD is it is a bridge between a simple syntax and a rich data model, right? That's the value proposition there. The point is not the cruft. The point is the cruft is the way to get to the richer data model that supports the open world model, that then allows you to accumulate information across resources without writing custom code, that allows you to use tools that are designed to reason over arbitrary domains. So you're not going to get to something like a knowledge graph by having 10 level 2 JSON-based APIs. You get to a knowledge graph, which is a network-friendly way of contextualizing what you know as an organization, which is behind all that stuff on the right in Google. When you search for something and there's all that information on the right, that comes from Google's knowledge graph. And the knowledge graphs are emerging as a new way of talking about linked semantic related data, self-describing semantic related data, that's taking off in a big way. So right now, 45% of the indexed 12 to 15 billion web pages have this kind of semantic markup in it. Google, Yahoo, Yandex, Bing encourage you to put things like embedded JSON LD in HTML email that you send to people and that you put in documents, because they don't have to write custom code, and they're not going to write custom code to figure out what your organization is adding. So if you use a standard data model and a standard serialization of a standard data model to talk about things that are important to you, then anyone who understands the standards can ingest that information with zero effort. And so it's really in your organization's best interest to make it easy for people to absorb information about the value that you provide. Because given everyone has to deal with this explosion of data, and honestly, your individual APIs and my individual APIs are not of interest to anybody else enough to be able to write custom code for every single one of them. And so these standards are about surfacing the value in a very natural, easy to absorb way.
And we've got another comment here. Returning to the best friend analogy, no two organizations are the same. And even with an organization, there can be regional differences in how businesses describe their business, the same way that not everybody speaks the same language. So how does the linked data model accommodate for these very discrete differences?
That is entirely the whole purpose of the linked data model, right? These allow us to agree to disagree. Just because there are efficiencies when we use the same terms doesn't mean we are required to use the same terms. So the salient point with respect to JSON LD is that there is a context that maps the terms that are in the JSON into a larger view of the world. And we don't have to agree on what those JSON terms mean as long as we mean the same thing on the back end. And even if we don't use the same terms on the back end, the semantic technologies allow somebody else to say, well, that term and that term mean the same thing. So even though there are regional differences, there aren't fundamental differences in worldviews. It really comes down to, well, I use this term to to refer to a person, and you use this term to refer to a person, or I use this term to refer to an account, and you use this term to refer to an account. Those things are very easily managed. They're roadblocks, right, to sharing information. But the tools that we have available, that's not an issue. So don't for a moment think that I'm suggesting that this is all about getting everyone to agree. My position is any technology that requires consensus is dead on arrival.
And we're coming up to the end of time here, and I want to get at least a few points from you. You've covered a lot of really great stuff, but what is some additional advice you have for us to make better decisions or make better choices, as our title indicates?
Sure. So I would say it starts with understanding what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. Right. If you're thinking I'm taking some code and making it available via HTTP, that is a very short-sighted and not very useful perspective on the concept of the web. And we want to project a business value, and we want that business value to be as useful and usable for as long as possible. Right? I think those are reasonable expectations of the things that we produce. And so then it comes down to, what do I, as a consumer of this information or this value projection, have to do in order to take advantage of it? And we have these contrasting styles, right? There's the style of, I don't have to do anything because my tools understand the standards. And the other style, which is, I can't do anything without writing custom software. And when framed that way, it's really hard to make the case that this is a good scalable, projection of business value. And so I think that's the starting point, is like to understand why we're doing this, and then to say, okay, but I don't know how to do that. Well, there's lots of tutorials and books and things. Mike Amundsen and Leonard Richardson and Sam Ruby have a great series of books on hypermedia design through the O'Reilly series. It's a little bit dated, but the Rest and Practice book by Jim Weber and Ian Robinson, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the other guy's name, called Rest and Practice. Great introduction to these ideas. If you go to jason-ld.org, there's a description of the specs and the standards and a playground and things that you can play around with there. These are how you go about doing it. But you got to start with wanting to do it, right? I want to build APIs that have longevity, that don't break when I make backend changes, or if I switch technologies, or if I want to introduce some new features. And if that's not your goal, then ignore me and none of this matters, right? You're effectively saying, here's a class and here's some code that uses that class. I refactor the class, I have to refactor the code that uses the class, right? That's, as developers, we're very comfortable with that interaction, but that doesn't work when we start breaking that separation and saying anybody can use this at any time. Now I have to be careful about refactoring and making changes that break that dependency. Throwing stuff away and starting from scratch is a difficult position to justify. And so once you know why you're doing this, and once you want to produce things that have longevity and can evolve over time in the way that the web does and don't require custom software, then you'll be drawn towards different approaches and standards. And the cool thing is there's a ramp, right? It's not like a big bang thing that you have to do all at once. It's just start thinking about the identity space, then think about the interaction model, then think about the representation model, then think about how this information connects to other information within the organization. And given the explosion of data, we have to solve the data integration problem before your organization is going to be all that well prepared to benefit from things like machine learning. Because we're collecting this data and we want to use it. First, we have to know what's there. We have to find it. We have to integrate it. But if every machine learning activity involves weeks of integration up front, then it's hard to demonstrate the value proposition of being data-driven. So if you want to unlock these other capabilities to your organization, if you want to build knowledge graphs that represent what you know about your domain and your customers and all those sorts of things, then starting with a clear understanding of what the resources are and trying to make them flexible and stable is job one. Then thinking about the interaction model, and if that's where you get, that's a fine place to be, because then everything else can build off of that. You have to commit to the web before you can benefit from the web, is I think the short way of saying that. Are you muted? I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Cannot hear you.
Thank you. One question that came up as well, just as if folks want to dive deeper into this, of course, you do have the 2-day workshop coming up in October, the 20th and 21st. But one of the questions that came in was, well, what technologies are we using? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I suspect that this is not going to be tightly coupled to any language or framework.
No. And in fact, most of my design workshops, we don't even get to much running code, because to me that's the problem, is the focus on the code. Like, everybody, I understand everybody wants to know how to do this, but you can figure out how to do it. You have to design it first, right? And so that's the thing that most people don't have the experience, is designing things that have these characteristics. Beyond that, we'll have some examples that work with like Node and Spring Boot and some common frameworks, but the actual implementation is as irrelevant to the users of the information as what web server you use to serve up your web page, right? It's the HTML is the standard, JavaScript is the standard, style sheet CSS is the standard. Any browser knows how to interpret those things, so you need to design what you submit, right, to use the standards, and then anyone can use those. In terms of producing that, right, that's a separate issue. With Spring Boot, there's multiple approaches. There's Spring MVC, there's HitOS, there's the Jersey support. Those give you the ability to support level 2, level 3 kinds of systems. But that's a separate issue than the design issue. And in terms of additional places to look, again, I would really recommend Mike Amundsen's Hypermedia Clients book, RESTful Web APIs book from O'Reilly. Those are great resources to investigate.
And right before we close, because we are at the top of the hour, I want to mention just a couple more things for folks. Definitely, if you are interested in the architecture aspect of all of what we've been talking about, in addition, of course, to Brian's workshop and all of the upcoming workshops that we have listed on nofluffjuststuff.com, we have ArcConf, which is a dedicated conference for practicing and aspiring software architects. That's taking place in virtually later on this year, towards December, and you can find the details there at arcconf, archconf.com. And if you're interested more on the web side, we also have the Progressive Web Experience, which is entirely focused on modern web technologies and emerging web technologies, and that's going to be at progressivewebexperience.io. Of course, this year this is going to be a virtual event as well, and we also have the Tech Leaders Summit for folks who are interested in more of the leadership aspects of being in technology. That's techleadersummit.io. Of course, all of these are upcoming tour shows. We've got a No Fluff Just Stuff tour show starting in October 1st and 2nd, I believe. And you can find that at nofluffjuststuff.com. We have a ton of different half-day and full-day workshops, and all of that is at nofluffjuststuff.com. We'd love to see you there. But the other thing is, if you want to catch the recording for this workshop or this webinar, that will also be at nofluffjuststuff.com. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us. And Brian, go ahead.
I just want to say you just made an important point, and I think part of why this is so difficult is because an API is not code, an API is not data, an API is not architecture, an API is not business requirements. It's all of those things, right? And so it's this intersection of everything that you just mentioned, right? The progressive web, architecture, tech leadership. the code implementation. It's the intersection of those things that really allow an API to project the value that an organization has. So I just wanted to say that was a nice accidental summary as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, once again, Brian, thank you for your time, for your expertise. As always, it is illuminating, and all the folks out there, thank you. I hope to see you somewhere virtually or in person or whatever circumstances allow soon. But thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.